Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today's Venable monthly webinar. The topic today is tips, traps, and trends, developments, and practical considerations in charitable fundraising. I'm George Constantine. I'm chair of the nonprofit organizations practice group here at the firm, and I'm very pleased and excited to be able to introduce briefly our speakers and this topic today. As many of you are probably likely aware, and one of the reasons you may be on today's webinar is the compliance issues with charitable fundraising laws and regulations can be a very daunting task. We think that today's program will help a lot of you make sense of those various rules and regulations and maybe leave you some practical tips. It will help your organization more comfortably navigate the issues. We have two great panelists today. Both of them happen to be named Christina to lead you through today's section, both of whom also happen to be members of our nonprofit organizations practice. Christina Vessels first is a counsel in our practice. She's been working on these issues for almost 10 years for a number of our nonprofit organization clients. And she's really become a nationally recognized lawyer on these matters, particularly related to fundraising registration regulations and rules. And there's a lot of other issues that she'll address in her day-to-day work outside of this area, but this is definitely one that she's done a lot of work on, not just representing charitable organizations, but also at times advising businesses and for-profit ventures on their cause-related marketing and maybe helping them meet their corporate philanthropic objectives. With Christina Vessels is Christina Lara, and Christina Lara is an associate in our practice, and she works closely with nonprofit compliance issues, governance, transactional matters, and has done a significant amount of work in this area as well. Before coming to Venable, Christina Lara served on the staff of a nonprofit organization and has also done some stints with the General Counsel's Office of the Smithsonian Institution and the Obama Foundation. So a little bit of experience from the inside on a few of those organizations before coming to us. With that brief introduction, I'll turn it over to the experts here, and I think Christina Vessels will be the one to start. Thanks again for everyone for participating, and I know you're going to enjoy it. Christina, over to you.
All right. Thank you, George. I really appreciate the introduction, and thank you all for joining us. Over the course of the next hour, we're going to draw on our collective experience in the charitable fundraising sector to explain and highlight a few core concepts that are really focused on online fundraising issues. And this will include, we'll explain the overarching framework for states' charitable solicitation laws and navigating thorny issues related to those. The trick here is that the way fundraising happens online isn't always perfectly captured by the text of these statutes. So we're going to talk about a few practical and logistical considerations to help your organization navigate those threshold issues. Finally, we'll close out with a look at recent legislative changes, including the California Charitable Fundraising Platform Rules, that is AB 488. We know that issue in particular has many of you in knots, so please do stick around through the entire hour, as we're first going to lay some sort of basic foundational issues to then tee up the more complicated issues arising out of AB 488. So as I mentioned, we have a relatively full hour, but please do not hesitate to put your questions in the Q&A chat. Christina and I will do our best to sort of navigate those issues as they come up, but if we don't get to them today during the session, we're more than happy to follow up afterwards. And one final housekeeping note, this program is being offered for CLE credits, so please do stay tuned, and we'll announce that at about the halfway mark. So without further ado, let's dive in and consider the underlying framework for charitable fundraising regulation in the US. As you may well know, states' charitable solicitation laws regulate how nonprofits solicit contributions and how certain fundraising related activities, like those that are undertaken by volunteers or other third parties, need to be carried out. The reach of the regulation for third-party fundraisers extends not only, as I said, to those who are paid, but also unpaid volunteers or companies that sort of derive benefit indirectly, such as those that engage in commercial co-venture activity and similar types of activations. So when your organization, whether on its own or through others, will engage in fundraising in a state, then you really do need to think about whether registration with that state's charity authority is required. In general, this means a nonprofit should be registered at least in its home state. In addition, though, depending on the activities you engage in, you'll sort of come to a different calculus of whether it would be prudent or advisable to register in more states or even on a nationwide basis. And so determining where your organization should register really requires a close look at how your organization is raising money. If you have a physical presence in a state, that is certainly a trigger for registration. That includes things like direct mail or calling into a state where you have that sort of true physical nexus into the state. But that is by no means the only way to trigger registration. Online activities can also rise to the level of on their own requiring registration. So at the end of the day, we want to just keep in mind that this regulatory framework exists to give the public clear information about charities and what they are doing in their states. And it serves sort of the larger goal of having an informed and therefore safeguarded public. So that's sort of the policy reason behind it all. About 40 jurisdictions in the US regulate the solicitation of contributions for charitable purposes. As mentioned, these laws serve principally to protect the public from fraudulent activity perpetrated, in the name of serving a charitable purpose. And to carry out or meet this objective, states typically require organizations to register before fundraising. Then, you'll file annual or in rare cases biannual reports and make certain disclosures when communicating with donors. A small minority of states do not require all charitable organizations to register before fundraising. This includes, Texas, which has a couple of different statutes, but include things like regulation of nonprofits that solicit for law enforcement by phone. But in general, regardless of whether you're dealing with a broad-based statute or a more narrow one, the general framework is the same. You should really be considering whether you need to be registered prior to soliciting. And I will note that in this context, charitable organizations should be broadly understood. It is not limited to what the IRS views as 501c3 charitable activity. We're really looking at, the underlying nature for which the purpose of the funds are used. And so, are there educational or philanthropic, social welfare, public health, any other sort of broad-based charitable purpose, you should be really asking, if registration is required. So if charitable or organizations is defined so broadly, what about soliciting? Soliciting is also very broadly defined, and it includes any request for a contribution by a nonprofit or somebody working on its behalf, where an appeal is made for a charitable purpose or where the name of a charitable organization is used in the appeal, or even any sort of statement that suggests that all or part of a contribution will be used for a charitable purpose. This is very broad and covers essentially any request for funding. So whether a pitch is made in a small closed-door setting to C-suite executives of a prospective corporate donor, or whether you're planning to blast, all over social media platforms, your next fundraising appeal, those are really all forms of solicitation, and everything in between would be covered as well. And so really you just want to be mindful that it will be a solicitation is much broader than just what we've sort of classically considered as, fundraising pitch materials like, broad-based direct mail. And so one other note is that charitable solicitation activity can trigger registration requirements, even if they don't specifically ask for a contribution to the charity. So indirect appeals, like indicating that a portion of a purchase will benefit a charity, sort of at no additional charge to the purchaser, that can qualify. And there are other forms of sort of indirect. And so really we should be coming at this question of, most, if not all, sort of broad-based appeals for funding can be considered a form of charitable solicitation. So conceptually, most of us have an easy enough time understanding when a nonprofit is physically soliciting in a state. But online fundraising definitely gives a few of us heartburn. And I know I get this question and sort of trigger my inner, Chrissy Teigen. Do you really need to? Is it really that I've emailed someone in a state? Does that trigger registration? All I have is this donate now button. Is that enough to trigger registration? I think the reason many of us don't enjoy this question is in large part because state laws really aren't particularly specific about the topic. So let's kind of cover a few basics to figure out how we'll analyze whether online fundraising can trigger registration. Keep in mind that most states' charitable solicitation laws hit the books before the rise of the internet, at least before the rise of the internet sort of as we know it today. To help deal with this new technology, at least new in 2001, the Charleston Principles were adopted by the National Association of State Charity Officials, or NASCO for short. This was an effort to provide some level of common guidance of when an organization's fundraising might require registration. Now, these are non-binding principles that the state charity regulators, coalesced around as a workable framework for assessing this online registration issue. And there are a few questions that, really kind of help us navigate the framework. I will say, keep in mind, only 3 states have actually codified this, but by and large, this is sort of considered an industry practice to consider these, principles when figuring out whether online registration can trigger, whether online fundraising can trigger registration obligations. The first decision tree is a relatively easy one. First, the Charleston Principles say that an entity that's domiciled within a state and uses the internet to conduct fundraising in that state should register. This is really true whether or not the fundraising methods used online are passive or interactive, whether it's engaged in by a third party or your own organization on its own behalf. Really, you're just asking, is the state where my principal place of business is located, does that state have a charitable solicitation law regime? If yes, then register. Once you look beyond your home state's borders, though, that's where things get a bit more complicated, but I promise it is ultimately, understandable and we can all make sense of it. So moving from left to right on our decision tree, first, even if you're not in your home state, don't overlook the obvious, which is if you're physically reaching into the state, you should register. But next, let's say you don't have an in-state presence. Then we would want to consider, do you have an interactive website? This includes, for example, a website with a donate now feature or other means of accepting online donations. If you do, then you may need to register if you answer yes to either of 2 sort of sub-questions. Are you specifically targeting residents of a particular state? If yes, then maybe registration is required. Or are you receiving substantial or repeated and ongoing contributions? I'll expand on what it means to specifically target or what counts as substantial, repeated, and ongoing in just a moment. But to round out the Charleston Principles decision tree, if those first few considerations don't apply to you because you are neither in state nor do you have an interactive website, let's just say you just have a website with no other sort of interactivity with the public. That would be considered a non-interactive or a passive only website. The last question here really sort of bounces you back to the middle of the decision tree where you're asking, does your website invite further activity and involvement with your organization? If so, do you also meet the substantial or repeated and ongoing tests? If those offline interactions can rise to a certain level of being repeated and ongoing, for example, you may need to register at that point. So we used a few terms of art here, and let's talk about what it means to specifically target residents using an interactive website or online feature. You might be asking yourself, whether your nonprofit's website explicitly references receiving contributions from within a state. So for example, hey, Maryland, let's continue to support our neighbors affected by last summer's hurricane. That could be considered, an implied or indirect request for contributions within the state. But, there are other examples, such as if your organization is affirmatively or directly soliciting contributions that would lead you to know, or put you in a position where you reasonably could know that the recipient of your email solicitation is in a particular state. So oftentimes this requires a little bit of hindsight, where you might have a donate now button on your website, and at the outset, you may not be soliciting in any one particular state, but you start to realize after the fact that there's a pattern of contributions coming in from a certain state. Now, at that point, you may really need to consider whether registration would be required. One question came in on the website about whether the Charleston principles are applied solely to online activity. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the whole scope of it. It was sort of a holistic view of those principles, but that's probably part of a larger conversation. So what about the repeated and ongoing, or the substantial basis sort of thresholds? Whether your website is interactive or not, we need to figure out, what does this mean? The Charleston principles gave color to these terms. And as I mentioned at the outset, only 3 states have actually codified their own version of the principles and fleshed out what their respective standards are. But in terms of repeated and ongoing, this is really defined by looking at the number of contributors during a year, whereas determining whether contributions are substantial generally is considered as a total dollar amount, or as a percentage of contributions of your organization's overall income. On the lower end, we see that, having, just 25 donors can be considered repeated and ongoing contributors. And there are similarly various thresholds for the financial metrics of whether something is considered substantial. So we've been considering whether online fundraising efforts can give rise to an obligation to register according to states' charitable fundraising regulations. But I'd be remiss not to point out that there are limited exceptions for the types of entities that must register, even if an online activity would generally be considered soliciting for purposes in all states. So the key, though, is that applicable exemptions within each state really vary widely. There are general themes, of course, but even within, say, for example, the educational institution exemption, the scope of that exemption will vary. Sometimes it exempts all accredited educational institutions. Others limit it to just those certified or accredited by that state's state license, state board of education, or the like. So really, this does require a bit of a case-by-case analysis to see if you apply. And importantly, even if you do qualify for exemption according to a state solicitation law, they're not all automatic. So some states will require organizations to nonetheless submit a one-time application to request confirmation of exemption, or otherwise, receive formal recognition from the state about your organization's exempt status. Typically, though, once you are recognized as exempt, usually no further action is required to maintain that exempt status. So, do think about whether, a one-time examination of these issues may be sort of money well spent, or effort well spent, to figure out if you can cut down your compliance obligations and get sort of a green light moving forward. So as I mentioned, speaking of action, although charitable solicitation law compliance usually isn't the main motivating factor for state charity regulators' enforcement of their laws, enforcement does happen. This can, if a state regulator finds that your organization has been soliciting contributions without being properly registered or having recognition of exempt status, it could result in fines or other penalties. This is often for many organizations not a huge risk factor, but certainly something that you should be aware of when considering your organization's overall risk tolerance and deciding whether, and if so, where to register. Because at the end of the day, balancing that risk tolerance, covering your organization's plans for growth and, the nature of pursuing new sources of revenue, that all really ought to be considered with a holistic and also a long-term view, because, we want to be thinking about not just, what registration is required today, but what might you need in 6 months or a year, because oftentimes the nature of fundraising opportunities can often move very quickly, and at the same time, getting the paperwork in place and having your approvals stamped and put online by state charity regulators isn't always necessarily a very quick process. So, really thinking about what is, the intended nature of your fundraising. Are you actively reaching out to donors to have more of a broad-based, public social media campaign, or are these sort of, discrete one-off, meetings or things like that with high net worth individuals? Although both may trigger registration, sort of on the whole, you may sort of balance out, what that means for your organization. I will say one significant practical pointer here to consider is that you're much better off sort of thinking about registration up front and before you submit your paperwork to states, because withdrawing registrations is a much more challenging endeavor. At that point, although the statutory framework in any particular state hasn't changed, if you are sort of overly conservative in your initial registration and realize later your organization is actually not equipped to withdraw, you may need to make certifications and formal attestations to state regulators saying that you will engage in no activity in the state. And this could mean sort of pulling down online fundraising mechanisms or other activities like that, and able to make those attestations and formally withdraw from a particular jurisdiction. So I just want to call out that these questions, many of you on this presentation may already be registered and have a compliance plan in place, but to the extent that you are newly considering this or considering this again for the first, for the first time in some time, you'll want to think carefully about, striking that balance of not over registering, but definitely meeting sort of the spirit of these laws. So from here, I'll turn it over to Christina, Lara, to help guide us through the registration and renewal process and to highlight some very recent legislative developments in this space.
Thank you so much, Christina. First, before I get started, I wanted to give the CLE code for those of you who are seeking credit. Today's code is Fundraising 2024, and you can use that code for your CLE credit. So, as Christina said, once your organization has decided to register, you're going to want to make sure that you're handling the initial registration process and the annual renewal filings properly. So first, I'm going to walk you through some of the key process points for you to think about. Second, I'll highlight a few traps for the unwary that can have ripple effects across your organizations. Third, and finally, I will cover a few changes out on the legislative horizon. So first, process points and initial registration. So unfortunately, there's really no single universal charitable solicitation registration form or process. This means that registration will require getting familiar with state-specific forms that you'll generally find on the website of each regulatory authority. Keep in mind, and I believe this question came up in the chat, that soliciting contributions in a handful of states may also trigger the requirement that the organization has to register as a foreign corporation or with the state tax authority. In those states, you might find that merely soliciting contributions is considered doing business. But fortunately, most registrations generally will ask you for the same information, which usually will consist of a registration statement, supporting documentation, and a filing fee. So the registration statements will request basic information about the organization, its charitable purposes, its governance structure, and its finances. Most states will also require the organization to submit a list of its officers and directors, professional fundraisers if you're using them, and a list of other states in which the organization solicits or plans to conduct solicitations. The supporting documentation will generally include a copy of the IRS determination letter, a copy of the Articles of Incorporation and bylaws, and the IRS Form 990 or its functional equivalent. And finally, you'll find that registration fees really vary by state and often by an organization's revenue. Filing fees can range from as little as $10 to four-figure filing fees per state. So you also find that the initial registration must be signed by the organization's leadership, which will often be the CEO and or the chief financial officer, though additional people may also be required to sign these filings. On to our second point, how to avoid the traps for the unwary. So while initial charitable registration and the subsequent annual renewals are not necessarily complicated, depending on the number of states in which an organization is registered, it will take some time to get familiar with the idiosyncrasies of various state filings. Because when it comes to charity filings, the devil really is in the details. Thankfully, most states now accept online registration forms. But some states, Illinois, for example, still require handwritten signatures on all the forms, and others, like Virginia, only accept charity renewals submitted by mail. Illinois and New Jersey are also notoriously slow to process their registrations. And we've encountered instances in which the check with the filing fee expires before the state even has a chance to review the application. And in other cases, we have seen the state come back with questions related to filings that were submitted years prior. So as part of your organization's processes, we strongly recommend that you have a system to confirm not just that materials have been timely submitted, but also to ensure that they have actually been processed. Some other state examples, Massachusetts, Mississippi, New York, and Tennessee. These are states in which the filings can helpfully be submitted online, but they all require the officers of the organization to approve a subsequent auto-generated email that will come into the inbox after the filing has been submitted. So this seems simple, but this will require that you have close coordination between the team who submits the filing online and those officers who have to sign off to be sure that those state-triggered emails don't expire before the officer has had a chance to even review the correspondence. Sometimes that's as little as 24 hours. California, we love California. This is another state that currently only accepts charity filings via mail, which again makes processing time extremely slow. And this is a good example of a state where small variations or errors in a filing can have really wide-ranging consequences for the organization. For example, California, and we've experienced this, California might reject a filing in which an organization has answered none instead of 0 in response to certain questions. Well, this seems like a small point that's easily fixed by a phone call, right? Well, unfortunately not. Once the organization gets around to resubmitting the filing, it may already be overdue, and that will further delay the processing. And it'll go to the back of the queue, and months might pass. In California, operating without a current registration is grounds for the Attorney General's office to issue a cease and desist order until the registration is current again. And this can take months to fix. So the good news, I will say, rumored from California, is that filings will be migrating online within the next year. So hopefully, our fingers are crossed that this will greatly expedite the process for having renewal materials reviewed and approved by the state. Third and finally, as Christina noted, I want to note some recent legislative changes to state charitable solicitation laws, with a number of other states considering legislative proposals at this point as well. So in the last 2 weeks, Tennessee and Utah have signed into law bills that have replaced state-specific charity registration financial forms, as I discussed previously, with requirements to submit only the Form 990. This would certainly simplify the obligations of charitable registrants in those states. Utah took it a step further than Tennessee by also eliminating the initial charitable registration requirement in that state. At the same time, the new laws take opposite approaches to the requirements for charities that benefit from charitable sales promotions. On the one hand, Utah currently requires charities to provide notice of any commercial co-venture activity from which they will benefit. But beginning next year, the state will do away with that requirement. On the other hand, Tennessee has no such requirement now, but would require charities to notify the state of any CCV campaigns from which they will benefit once that law goes into effect. In short, it's not every day that states update their charitable solicitation laws, but here we have what I think can fairly be said is an overall net positive development in terms of simplifying charities' registration requirements. So I'll turn it back over to Christina to talk about online fundraising.
All right, thank you for that. Certainly Christina's insights, especially into California and the processing issues there, are going to be really relevant to another legislative change that is having a big effect on the status quo of charitable fundraising compliance. As I previewed at the outset, California's new law, AB 488, which regulates online charitable fundraising platform activity, has entered into the arena and is definitely commanding our attention at this point. As of January 1st of last year, that is 2023, customer donation programs, multi-beneficiary CCV promotions, and other types of cause marketing campaigns that are offered online, and even much broader than just cause marketing, any type of online activity, at least those campaigns or activations that solicit donations from or are available to prospective donors in California are subject to a new regulatory scheme in the state. That's because California now regulates any entity that uses the internet to provide or make available to California donors a website or other service whereupon fundraising can occur. So this new activity qualifies the actor, or rather this activity qualifies the actor now as a charitable fundraising platform in the state. In addition, the state law now also regulates platform charities. These are charitable organizations that effectively serve as intermediaries for online fundraising efforts between the charitable fundraising platforms themselves and perhaps the named or ultimate beneficiaries of the online activity. Finally, as I just mentioned, the final recipients of funds under this new framework are called the, quote, recipient charitable organizations. And they're also going to be subject and are subject to a handful of new requirements under the law. What doesn't change in the law is that, charitable organizations that would have otherwise registered in California should continue to maintain those registrations. But it gets a little bit murkier for smaller organizations that perhaps, didn't have any real presence in California prior to, online platform activity. In the new law, I think what's important to sort of have all of us wrap our collective arms around are the 5 examples of platform activities or platform categories, you might think of them as, that are going to be subject to the new law. Because many of you in the audience may represent charitable organizations. You may be thinking, well, I'm not, a quote platform, these rules don't apply to me. But really understanding, what your corporate sponsors may need to grapple with, and being an advocate or, an educator on these concepts, we probably are all better served by that. So there's certainly something in this for everyone, whether you're here representing a nonprofit or a platform charity or a recipient charitable organization. All right, so as I mentioned, there are 5 platform types, and I'm going to sort of briefly cover all 5 just to give you a little bit of the lay of the land of what's included. Discussing and analyzing sort of what qualifies as these different types could be, an hour-long presentation unto itself, but let's kind of give a high-level overview of, in general, what the regulations are likely to address and what the law generally has outlined so far. First, you have platforms that use the internet to solicit contributions in California by listing recipient charitable organizations that will receive donations directly or, to whom donations may be recommended via a platform charity. You'll most commonly see this type of activity in an online scenario where customers are afforded the opportunity to add a donation to their transaction or to round up the change from a transaction to the next whole dollar. This type of activity would qualify the platform, more often than not, the for-profit entity in this arrangement, as this first type A category of a charitable fundraising platform. Second, you have platforms that allow crowdfunding or peer-to-peer fundraising activity to occur on their site. So where you might sign up for a raise perhaps, and then leverage your social media network to help you hit a particular fundraising goal for, your charity run. This might be considered a type B or the second variety of the charitable fundraising platform activities. Third, you have platforms that enable users to pick one or more charitable beneficiaries to receive charitable donations that are raised based on purchases made on the platform or website or other interactions on the site. So say, for example, that the platform or an online retailer says that for every purchase of our XYZ product, the company will donate 5% to a charity of your choosing, or maybe the company will donate 5% to a handful of charities that have partnered with the retailer. This type of purchase-based or interaction-based donation that's distributed to an organization that the user selects would fall into this third category, type C. Importantly, other activities beyond charitable sales promotions would qualify. The key in this particular category is to keep in mind that it is the user or purchaser that has control over, or some control over the eventual charitable organization to whom the donation is recommended. In comparison to type C, which we just reviewed, the fourth type of platform activity is generally the same activities and triggers as in type C, but the user or the purchaser on the platform does not select the eventual charitable beneficiary. Rather, the platform simply says, when you do or buy X on our site, we'll donate to this specific charity. So otherwise, in really most material ways, type C and type D are the same. The difference really lies with who gets to pick which charity benefits from the platform user's activity. For those of you who are well-versed in the cause marketing compliance space, you might be asking yourselves, well, this really seems a lot like the existing charitable solicitation laws and those rules in California. Does the platform rule displace the existing California, commercial co-venture rules? no, not really. There's definitely overlap, but importantly, the CCV rules still exist. The key here is asking how many charitable organizations benefit from sort of CCV type activity online from a platform. An entity that meets the definition of both a platform and a commercial co-venturer will only be a commercial co-venturer to the extent that the acts of solicitation through the website directed to persons in California are for 6 or fewer recipient charitable organizations per calendar year. So if it is more than that, then you're looking at the charitable fundraising platform rules. So if, for example, one of your corporate sponsors conducts a charitable sales promotion online, and your nonprofit organization is, the exclusive charity partner, at least for that 1 year, or you're, one of only 5 other charities, you're together with 5 other charities that the retailer supports through its online CCV activity, then that corporate sponsor is likely to still follow just the traditional CCV rules in California, barring any other efforts or things like that that might change that calculus, such as other online fundraising activities that the company engages in. They probably don't need to be worried about the charitable fundraising platform rules. Finally, you have this 5th category of a platform known as Type E, at least again in the pending regulations. Here you effectively have, private labeled integrated technology. Generally, this is going to fall into licensed software uses that a charity can then build into its own website, and similar type activities. So you'll really want to kind of examine what are the underlying activities there and work closely with your vendor or the charitable fundraising platform to decide whether the activity falls within the scope of the new law or not for some of these more fact-based analyses. So as I've alluded to, having a handle on what the law says is helpful, but regulations are still pending. So having a handle on what types of online efforts can trigger charitable fundraising platform activities at this point seems as much about education as it really is about compliance. So many of you will become sort of ambassadors for teaching, corporate sponsors or others in your sort of charitable fundraising space about potential obligations that platforms may have when it comes to this activity. Obviously, many of you are seeing that larger platforms have already been grappling with California's new law, but there's sort of this ripple effect from the larger organizations down to smaller ones where there's still very much room for all of us to be helping each other along. And I'm not sure if it's good news or bad news at this point, but we really only have the statutory provisions in place because implementing regulations have not been finalized. We do expect them to be finalized soon, but we also have said that a couple times now over the course of the last couple of years. So keep your fingers crossed that California's implementing regulations for the law will soon be finalized. But until then, the result is that only a limited number of the statutory requirements can actually be satisfied at this point. The California Attorney General's office itself has suggested that they're really going to enforce compliance with 4 main points. And that includes, whether the charities for whom funds are raised or recommended on these platforms are in good standing, that the platforms themselves maintain funds raised through the online platform activities in accounts separate from their own or other funds, that disclosures made on the site avoid donor deception or confusion. And then there are certain limited rules for when a charitable organization is listed on a platform without its express consent. And the state AG has said that those rules are in effect now. But let's really focus on good standing for a moment, because whereas the other Active provisions of AB 488 are generally easily digestible. Yes, okay, I need to maintain funds in a separate account. Got it, good. This idea of good standing is one that has actually brought many nonprofits' online fundraising efforts to a screeching halt in the last year, and it's having very real effects on nonprofit organizations now. As we said, a charitable fundraising platform or platform charity, which these terms are defined in California's charitable fundraising law, these are the platforms may only solicit or enable solicitations from persons within California, and they may only receive, control, or distribute funds from donations for charitable organizations that are in good standing. So according to the law, this means that the charitable beneficiary, the ultimate beneficiary, cannot have their tax-exempt status revoked by the IRS. They can't have their status revoked by the California Franchise Tax Board, and they cannot be prohibited from fundraising in California. Importantly, I should say not having your tax status revoked by the IRS or the FTB makes sense, right? It's this third prong of what does it mean to not be prohibited? And there is a material difference between not being prohibited by the California Attorney General from soliciting in the state, and being actively registered in California. California AB 488 requires the former. It is not saying that all charitable organizations necessarily need to be registered in the state. Rather, if you are registered or you should be registered, you need to sort of be up to date and have any delinquent or incomplete matters corrected. Plus, if you weren't previously registered, but you've been notified by the state attorney general that you should be, you should definitely start the process of sorting that issue out with the state. I'll hark back to what Christina said earlier. This is where, to the extent that you are registered, understanding the requirements for California and the intricacies there becomes really important, because you want to, at this point, sort of do everything you can do to make sure that you don't inadvertently end up being on the state's may not solicit list. So again, looking at this requirement that to be in good standing, you must not be prohibited from soliciting, I think complicating that particular analysis is this issue that California maintains a couple of different databases for charitable organizations in the state. So many of you may be familiar with the online registry search tool. This is a very helpful live, generally real-time resource for confirming the status of a charity that is or was registered with the state. But the registry doesn't capture organizations that are neither registered nor prohibited. So you might nonetheless meet the requirement for good standing because you are not on this other state list called the state's may not operate list. That is basically sort of the end all be all here. You want to make sure that your organization does not end up on the may not operate list. But again, the may not operate list sort of has its own drawbacks, because while the registry database is updated often and such that many platforms, might want to rely on that in real time, the may not operate list is updated rather infrequently here. But again, platforms aren't going to have the resources to cross-check against all sorts of databases in the state for hundreds, if not thousands, of charitable organizations that might use the platform to do their fundraising. So, if you appear on the may not operate list, but soon thereafter, you get reinstated, you're very likely to appear on the state's real-time registry list. But it could take, the better part of a month or two to have the may not operate list updated such that you're no longer on that list. I realize that's a mouthful, but the long and the short of it is that until regulations are finalized, there really is sort of a little bit of a rub between, which resource must or should platforms rely on and what really makes sense for their business practices, where there is some, flexibility in the law for the platform to choose. So as I mentioned, platforms' reliance on the may not operate list can have adverse downstream consequences for your organization, even if you end up on that list for just a brief period. And so I hate to say it, but the process of getting off that list and then getting back online with the platform is going to require a lot of patience. So as again, first step is to triage the state compliance piece. What was the reason for appearing on the may not operate, may not solicit list in the first place, and rectify that as quickly, as you can. Because really, being unable to fundraise through an online portal for even a week could feel like an eternity for many of you. So truly, a multi-month stint in the penalty box can have very real consequences in terms of foregone revenue. So we really do encourage everyone to stay on top of all of their state charitable compliance obligations, but in particular, those in California. And so, yes, in response to a question that came in, the may not operate list is online. If you go to the California AG's description of charitable fundraising platforms, there are links to it there. That's probably the easiest way to get to it, but we can also include a link in our follow-up materials following this presentation. So, as I mentioned, the state is going to be expected to finalize these regulations soon, and that's going to affect a wide variety of, detail work, right? Like what reporting obligations is the platform going to even have? What signatures will be required? What disclosures need to be required? Although we've talked about, these 4 broad categories for the charitable fundraising platform kind of compliance regime right now that are live, that is confirming good standing, separating funds in different accounts, ensuring that disclosures, are clear and not misleading, and then, the non-consenting charity rules. There are a host of details that really we just don't have answers to yet, and we're hoping that we'll be able to do a follow-up presentation here where we can really get into a lot of the nitty-gritty of, who needs to be sending charitable donation receipts to donors. What's the timeline for doing that? Does that differ depending on the type of platform activity that the parties are engaged in? You remember those type A, B, C, D, E. All of these different kind of quirks in the law and permutations are going to have very real consequences. But, in large part, we're still a little bit in a holding pattern with California. And so, at this point, I think, the real name of the game is going to become working with charitable fundraising platforms to all kind of coalesce around an understanding of what California AB 488 really means for your organization. To be clear, there's sort of a fair amount of misinformation percolating, across various sites. The California AB 488, for example, does not preclude you, does not preclude donors from contributing directly to a charitable organization that, is on the state's may not solicit list, because perhaps they have rectified that issue and they're listed in good standing on the registry. But also, if they're not soliciting you and you just want to donate to them, donations can still flow. So there really is just kind of a host of practical sort of where the rubber meets the road type scenarios that we really are very much waiting to see. But I think being in contact with entities that you understand to fall under the charitable fundraising platform rules is helpful to do proactively rather than reactively. A lot of these platforms are rolling out new terms and conditions. They're putting out, specifics for what they will require charitable organizations to show them in terms of being reinstated on the platform, separate and apart from whatever the state database shows. There are going to be some platform specific rules that we're going to have to deal with. And again, this goes back to that educational mission of everybody kind of keeping the channels of communication open so that when the California final regulations come through, we're all able to sort of more quickly and efficiently get everybody up and running. And so, with that, I think we want to thank you all very much for coming into today's presentation on online charitable fundraising issues. I think, the takeaways really often are that you're going to have to take, a fairly individualized approach to what charitable fundraising compliance will entail for your organization, and what your organization's, frankly, risk tolerance is. If you are having one-on-one meetings with high-level executives, that is a solicitation if you are asking them for contributions, but balance that with the state's desire to the purpose behind these charitable solicitation laws is to protect the public and to make sure that donors are informed about the charitable purposes and beneficiaries that they intend to support. And so a lot of this is gray, and I know that can be frustrating for the regulated community, but having an informed decision-making tree is really the best and sort of first step in making sure that your organization's charitable fundraising compliance keeps you out of hot water. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and I look forward to answering many of these questions that came in that we just didn't have time for live during the session through follow-up emails with the attendees. So thank you all for joining us.